right. Well, welcome tonight to How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and this is our 6th session. We've got 2 more sessions to go to finish out How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And tonight we're going to spend most of our time just talking about the law and how we handle the law. Question off the bat is, well, what is the law? And the answer is that the law is a group of arbitrary, annoying regulations that were written to limit human freedom. All right? That's the standard interpretation of the law. The reality, though, is when we're asking the question, what is the law in the Bible, the New Testament often uses the name law to describe a lot of different things. For example, it often refers to 600 laws, which is how many laws there are in the Old Testament, a little bit more than 600. Some count 613. Different ways to count that. Sometimes this refers to all of them together, a collection, and sometimes it refers to any of them separately. So it's a little bit confusing when you're reading the New Testament and it says the law. So sometimes it refers to all 600 or so, and sometimes it refers to the whole collection of them. It also sometimes refers to the religious system, meaning the system of sacrifices and the system that is associated with practicing the Jewish faith. Other times, it refers in the New Testament to laws of the rabbis, their own interpretation of the law, what we'll sometimes call the oral law. But they'll say, well, the law says, but in fact, it's not the law that says it, it's just they say it, or some rabbi said it. And so sometimes we have to kind of see that meaning. But the best understanding of the law really is to think of the law as these 5 books, sometimes called Pentateuch, meaning the 5 teachings, or the Torah, as the Jews sometimes refer to it, which is just the instructions, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And in here we find the story, the big story of God's Exodus, his saving, God saving his people, or put another way, it is getting Israel out of Egypt, then getting Egypt out of Israel. And that is, in a sense, what the law is also about. But with all these different definitions of what is the law, then the question comes, well, what do we do with the 600 and plus laws that we read about in the Old Testament? How are we to understand them? How do we make sense out of them? Well, the first thing we have to do is to realize they're not all the same. There are some laws, there are different types. Some laws are civic laws. They're the laws of a city. They're the laws that relate to criminal behavior, things that are illegal that we would think of today. Some laws are religious ritual laws of the temple. And so they pertain to the temple or to the tabernacle previously to that. And then some laws are of an ethical nature about human behavior. Now, if you take all the laws and you put them into 2 categories, there's 2 forms of laws. And you probably read this if you read through the material. If you didn't, you may have heard this at some place or another. But there are 2 ways to describe laws in the Old Testament. One is the technical term apodictic, and we know the word dictator and dictation and this sort of thing. So we can kind of figure out that this has something to do with giving a kind of specific instruction. And the other is casuistic or case law. So what are the difference between those? Apodictic is just simply the do's and the do-nots. And the problem of the do's and the do-nots is that they're exemplary and not exhaustive. For example, what happens if you kill someone? Well, the answer to that in the book of Exodus is you die, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But then you read later on and it says, if you accidentally kill someone, because you were cutting a tree and it fell and killed someone, you better not stick around. You better flee to a city of refuge and try to get someone to protect you from this person who's going to come and take revenge. In other words, these laws require an interpreter. An interpreter could be a group of elders in a local community, or more often than not, it is a judge who has the role of interpreting the law. In other words, the apodictic laws of the Bible require an interpretation. They're exemplary and they are not exhaustive. The case laws are the other examples, and they are examples of case by case. And there are 600 of them all by themselves in the Old Testament. They're conditional. They apply in only certain situations to certain people. Guess how many of them are found in the New Testament? The answer is none, which is interesting. What would be an example of a case law? In Deuteronomy 15:12, it says, "If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years," in other words, they become your slave, "in the 7th year, you must let them go free." Now, I know that that is not a law that applies to many of us in our world today. In fact, it probably doesn't apply to virtually anyone in the world today. And that's because this was a particular case in a particular situation as it relates to the Old Testament. It's important for us to know that. So the question then will come, with all of these laws that require either interpretation by a judge or cases that don't seem to apply in our world today, why read it? What value is there in reading this or even trying to apply this part of the law? Well, there's actually an answer to that, and that is that the law shows us something about God. It shows us that God cares about us. He's made provisions for us and provisions for his people. God is compassionate and loving, and that he is a God of character who is consistent in the way that he understands and relates to us. Now, a really good way to understand these laws of the Old Testament is to compare them to the other laws of the ancient world. And in comes one of the most famous examples in all of human history. 1800 years ago, there was an Akkadian law code, but 1726 years old, 1726 BC, 1800 BC and 1726 BC is longer than 1800 years ago. It's 3800 and 3700 years ago, is the code of Hammurabi. This is a very famous example of an ancient law. And you can read in the codes of Hammurabi various laws, as well as in the laws of the Akkadian people from 1800 BC. So, for example, it'll say, if a free man has no claim against another free man, but seizes the other free man's servant girl, detains the one seized in his house, and causes her death, he must, as a punishment, give 2 servant girls to the owner. There's no punishment other than the restitution of property, because a person in this context, a servant, was seen as purely human property. The same is true in the law code of Hammurabi. You had to pay a half mina of silver. In other words, the laws of the ancient world viewed human beings in many cases as just simply property. And then in walks the Old Testament law. You shall not murder applies to men and to women. Both have value in the eyes of God. And there are other examples of the way the law of the Old Testament shows us the character and the goodness and the compassion of God toward all his people. Servants are protected under the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy 23, whereas in these other laws, there wasn't much provision to protect them. In some of the laws, children could be punished for their parents' misbehavior. Now, I don't know, as a kid, I would have really liked that kind of law, but most of us today would say, that doesn't seem right. Neither did God, because in Deuteronomy 24:16, he reversed it. It's interesting what we find when we compare the ancient laws to the biblical law that we read in the Bible. And what we find is a lot about the goodness of God. Now, here's a question, though. What was the real problem of the law in the Old Testament? Why do the Israelites not actually do it? The answer that we usually think is, it was just too hard and we just can't really do it. But the problem, authors say, was not the inability to keep the law. It was what? It was an unwillingness to keep it. Again and again and again, that was the issue. So here's our question, these thousands of years later. What do we do with it as New Testament Christians? Do we follow the Old Testament law or not? This question comes up actually quite a bit. I seem to get this question more often than not. Well, the answer is, first of all, and the authors do a great job with this, by establishing the fact that the Old Testament law was given inside of the Old Testament. The word testament means covenant, a relationship between God and his people. A covenant is a covenant agreement. Now, the way the law is given in the Old Testament was in a standard style. And maybe you read this or not, I don't know, but it's called a suzerainty covenant. It's between a suzerain, which is an overlord, and a vassal, which is a weaker servant. And the sovereign makes an agreement with the vassal and says, okay, if you will agree to these things, then you will get this, and if you don't, then this is what's going to happen to you. It forms literally 6 parts. There's a preamble, a prologue, stipulations, witnesses, sanctions, document. This is a pretty formal kind of legal thing. Well, as you read the Old Testament, you find that that is actually there. It starts with a preamble between God and Israel, a prologue about how parties connected, stipulations, which are the laws, do this, do this, do this. Witnesses, God, who witnesses it, and then sanctions, which are blessings and cursings. If you do what's written in the law, you'll be blessed, and if you don't, you will be cursed. That's the covenant at Mount Ebal in the Old Testament. And then there's a document that gives provisions for review, which Israel did again and again. In the Old Testament law is a covenant, and that means this. God has made an agreement between himself and Israel in the law that establishes the terms of the relationship, the means of loyalty, and the blessings and curses of disobedience. Why does it matter? It matters because you and I cannot understand the Old Testament story without knowing this. You cannot understand what we're going to study here in just a moment next, which is the prophets, without knowing this. Their entire job is to remind everybody of this. This is a covenant between God and his people, and they need to do it or else. Now here's the answer to our question. It is not our covenant. The covenant that God made with Israel in the Old Testament was the covenant God made with Israel in the Old Testament. He didn't make that covenant with us, and therefore that covenant is not our covenant. Christians are under what the Bible calls a new covenant relationship, a relationship with God that has new terms. For example, there's no terms in the New Testament for how we're supposed to go to the temple and make sacrifices with various animals. There isn't a temple anymore. In Matthew chapter 5:18, Jesus says that the law has been, quote, fulfilled. And that God's loyalty toward us, his expectation of loyalty to us, is under new terms. Now, to continue this thought, what about specific parts of the law? The civil and ritual, which are 2 forms I mentioned earlier. These do not apply to us. The civil law was Israel's criminal law. We have our own nowadays. And ritual law, which are priests and sacrifices. Hebrews 9:22 tells us those were a shadow of the things that were to come, but the reality is now found in Christ. We don't operate under those. And the New Testament affirms some ethical laws. This is the 4th thing. In other words, of all the laws, there are a couple that Jesus mentions. Now, which ones are they, I wonder? The answer is the love of God, Deuteronomy 6:5, and the love of neighbor, Leviticus 19:18. Those are the 2 that Jesus emphasizes. And he reinterprets all the laws in terms of this ethic of the kingdom, some people call it, in the Sermon on the Mount, which is basically the law of love. Loving God and loving your neighbor. We are not told, for example, we must keep the laws of the Old Testament, and we are not told we must keep the laws of the Sermon on the Mount. We are told how they fit within the kingdom ethic of love. That's what we find in the New Testament. The Old Testament, this is number 5, is the Word of God, but it is not the command of God to us. In Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, it says you should build parapets around your house. I've driven by some of your houses. I don't see any parapets out there. If you don't know what that is, that's the kind of fencing you're supposed to put on top of your house whenever you're walking around it so people don't fall off. Well, the reason is because they were flat roofs, and that's where you spent your summers, was up on the roof. Why would you have such a command? Why would God instruct them to do that? Because people could fall off and get hurt. And God cared about whether or not our neighbors could fall off a roof and get hurt. Because God cares about our neighbors. This is the character of God. We don't build parapets around our roofs, but we still love our neighbors. See, the command remains the same, but Jesus reinterprets it. In Galatians 6:2, Paul talks about the law of Christ. And basically, he summarizes all the laws in terms of what we just said. Here is the rule. The Old Testament law, for it to be applied to us, must be explicitly renewed in the New Testament. Assume nothing applies to you. Apply only what is explicitly said in the New Testament. That's a pretty incredible statement. I'm reading through all the laws of the Old Testament. I'm reading them. I'm trying to understand them. But I'm remembering, unless I find that in the pages of the New Testament, because the New Testament is the covenant relationship that I as a Christian am in, by way and through Jesus, that is where and how it applies to me. So then the question again is, what is the value of it? Why should I read it? Why should I study it? Well, for one thing, it's the story of Israel, salvation story. It shows us the character of God, the justice of God, the value of human life, of mercy. And it has other benefits. If you were to put into practice some of the things in the Old Testament, probably wouldn't hurt a whole lot. For example, when Leviticus 11:7, when they're told not to eat shellfish, the most common allergy that you have is to shellfish. Now, it may not be your allergy, it may not be your problem, but you could understand the human benefit that could come from following an instruction when you are a nation who doesn't have access to that kind of modern medical information. The models that we find in the Old Testament of the shedding of blood become for us the foreshadowing of Jesus on the cross and what he does for us, Exodus 29. Sometimes even the unusual prohibitions, like don't eat a cow with its milk in Deuteronomy 14:21, are insightful because they weren't given because there was something wrong with that. It's because the pagan nations were doing that, and God wanted us to be different than them. That makes sense. Or in Deuteronomy 14:28, when it mentions the third tithe, although I would love to preach about the third tithe, it was a provision for widows and for orphans and for foreigners. It was intended to bless those who were needy among the people of God. In our world, we've done many things to help make those provisions. So in other words, there's value there, but it is not a case in which all of those instructions directly apply to us, only if they're explicitly commanded. So we switch gears and we look at the prophets. And it's directly connected. The prophets of the Old Testament, this chapter is called Enforcing the Covenant in Israel, are divided into three groups: major, minor, and background. The major prophets, you can see them here listed out. Maybe you can see it. I'll read it to you if you can't see it well enough. And the minor prophets in the background. Before I kind of explain that, let me just tell you there are two kinds of prophets in the Bible as well, two other kinds of ways of classifying them. There are prophets who wrote, and there are prophets who didn't. There are literally hundreds of prophets who didn't write, and there are 16 who did. We have their writings. Their prophecy, the nature of it, was that prophets spoke for God, not normally to foretell the future, but to foretell it. The future was normally the near future. They weren't making the long-term prognostication. They were anticipating an immediate now event. It is estimated that only 2% of their material relates to Messiah, or is messianic, meaning 98% of what they're dealing with has to do with the immediate circumstances of the prophet himself. Their function was to enforce what we just said, the covenant that God had made with his people. Their job was to remind the people, this is the covenant, you made it, do it, or else. They were delivering God's message. In the Bible, in the Hebrew, they're called Navi, the messenger. That's what a prophet is. They were the representative of God. They have an office that's been anointed for that. And their message was really boring. It was not original. They almost never said something new. They just kept saying the same thing. Be faithful to the covenant that you made with Israel, with your God. So if we classify them, these 16 writing prophets, we classify them into the larger and to the smaller collections. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, because they're longer. And then the minor prophets are the ones we call the minor prophets. In Latin, they're called the shorter prophets. Now, what you have to do in order to understand the prophets of the Bible is you have to know this third component, which is the background. If you don't understand the background of the prophets, you'll never understand what they're doing and what they're talking about. Amos is the first of them, and he wrote in about 760. Malachi is the last of them, and he wrote in about 460. It's about 300 years, if you think about it, from Amos to Malachi. What happened during those 300 years? Two major events took place. The northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and the Babylonians came and conquered Jerusalem in 586 BC. Everything that happens in those books and in those stories is primarily about those two events. It is telling the people of the northern kingdom, like Amos, get ready, change, or God is going to bring his devastation on the people. To the southern kingdom, change, or God's going to bring judgment, and indeed, Babylon does that. Now there's a little bit of pre to that story, and there's a little bit after that story, because they also talk about the events that happened when they return and they come back into the land, and that's where you get to a prophet like Malachi. So you have to know that background. How do you know it? How do you figure it out? Exegesis. This is the reason we've got to do this. We've got to remember exegesis is knowing the historical context and the literary context. And we need resources to help us, especially at this point. Really good study Bibles, really good Bible commentaries that give background, Bible dictionaries. Here's another one I'd put on here. Bible handbooks. Somebody was here last time and suggested to me, why don't we as a church create a little research library out in the hallway and put some of these really good resources out there? And I said, I love that idea. Why don't you go do that? I do think that would be really good to have some really good resources so that people could come and get access to this kind of information. Now, if you had those resources, this is what you'd do. By the way, this is a beautiful picture of one of the Assyrian kings. I think it's Ashurbanipal, which also there's a collection in Fort Worth. There's one of there. But the two contexts that we want to look at is historical. So when we're in the prophets, you really need to know, is this the Assyrian story or is this the Babylonian one? Is this the one of the 700s or the one of the 500s? So you need to know that right off the bat. You also need to know whether or not it's not about those two, but it's about something that happens afterwards. So those will be your key things. Now, the other thing you need to know is that there are some other stories. For example, there is in Isaiah chapter 7 a very famous passage that talks about, and the virgin shall be with a child and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, Isaiah 7:14. The 7th chapter of the book of Isaiah is written where the prophet is giving a message to the king in which he says, you need to be aware of this, the situation that you're worried about, it's going to come to an end, and God is going to give you a sign that this war we're in is going to come to an end. Well, the sign ends up being the birth of this child and then growing up and knowing right from wrong, which is just a period of a few years, 10, 12 years. But the context of Isaiah 7 is a regional war in which the northern kingdom of Israel, which is sometimes in the Bible called Ephraim, has united themselves with Syria, and they are attacking the southern kingdom of Judea. And when king looks out from Jerusalem, he sees, he sees this foreign empire coming against him, including Israel itself, and he says, what should I do? As he walks around the pools and wonders what's to do. And the prophet Isaiah says, you need to trust God. He's going to resolve this problem for you. It's called the Syro-Ephraimite War. To understand the Syro-Ephraimite War is to understand the 7th chapter of the book of Isaiah. To not understand it would be a problem, right? Because you wouldn't know what's happening in the story to be able to explain it. So that's historical context. It's an example of that. So how do we do literary context? We talked about think paragraphs when we're reading Paul. Read between the lines when we read the narratives. Look at the horizontal and the vertical. Remember that in the Gospels? When we come to the prophets, think oracles. That's what you got to think. The oracles that we find in the prophets, they're these units, these paragraphs, these sections. The authors describe to us the different forms they have. Some are written in the form of a legal lawsuit in which God is issuing against his people. Others are just woes, woe unto you. Others are promises. Others are enactments. My favorite one is a messenger speech. It goes like this: Thus saith the Lord. I like that one. It's pretty clear what God wants you to hear in that one, right? Now, as you read these oracles and you see these units and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is this unit trying to say? You got to remember something else. Prophets were poets. They wrote poetry. Poetry has this thing called parallelism. It's what makes poetry poetry. Some poetry has a synonymous parallelism. Remember the word synonym means it's a similar word, sounds the same. So in Isaiah 44:22 it says, I have swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. He's picturing a cloud coming down, like fog setting in. They're synonymous. That's Isaiah 44:20. So we see that. They're not differing, they're synonymous. Psalms does the same thing, by the way. Sometimes it does the opposite. It's called antithetical. It does the reverse. Starts one way and ends another way. Hosea 7:14. They don't cry out to me from their hearts. They wail on their beds. It's different, isn't it? They're not crying out to God for help. They're just laying there in their misery and they're wallowing in their despair. They should be crying out to God. That's the idea, right? They should be doing that, but they're doing this other thing. That's antithetical. And then the other is synthetic, they call it, which is just a building. You just take the last one and you build on it. Obadiah 21. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. It's just builds one thought on the other. So you got to know those things. Okay, taking all of that and making it work in our world today is hermeneutics. We take it from that town to this town, from that ancient world to the modern world. What do we do? How do I take Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Amos and speak into our world today? Well, we have to determine what God's word to them was. That's the exegetical part. Then consider his word to us. Sometimes this is not that hard to do. I'll give you an example. The book of Amos. If you don't know the book of Amos, go home and read it. It's not that long, and it's a great example of this. The book of Amos, there's a scene in the opening chapter in which he sees a poor person being sold for a pair of sandals. And he says in Amos 2:6, that should not be among the people of God. We don't sell the needy for a pair of sandals. We don't need a whole lot of interpretation on that. That resonates culturally for us. We see what's wrong with that. We can understand it. That message then is still that message now. In Isaiah chapter 1, when he talks about using religion as a cloak to cover our greed or our injustice, we still have that in our world. Or in Hosea chapter 13, he talks about mixing your idolatry with God. It's a good thing we don't have idolatry anymore. We do, and we still are dealing with this subject in our own lives, in our personal lives. We understand that. So as you finish the chapter, one of the things that they did is they give us a few suggestions, and I'll just mention them to you as you think about the prophets. One is they issue a real careful warning about predictive prophecy. Well, it says in Isaiah that's what it means today. Be really careful with that. Be careful with the David Koresh type interpretation of the Bible in which we read it and we don't understand it and we apply it, and then suddenly you've got a whole cult movement built around it. The other is be really careful with reading an Old Testament passage and then contemporizing it in a way that you find a whole new meaning that looks nothing like the original meaning. And there's a term they use for this. I don't really want to get into it, but it's called sensus plenior. It's the idea of taking a fuller meaning out of an old text and trying to create a whole new meaning out of it. Be careful with that kind of thing. But then they end by saying that one of the things that we have in the prophets, and I would say also in the law, is that it helps us to think about and understand and relate to God appropriately. It's a lot less about how to live. And so we may read the prophets and go, you know what? I'm not taking anything home with me, practically speaking. But it is a lot about understanding who God is and the kind of God that he is and the kind of God that we serve and we worship. So it's kind of a worshipful opportunity as we study the prophets and as we study the law to understand more about the nature and the goodness of our God. And it's 6:30, and we're done. I'll see you next time.